Welcome. You're connected to transmissions from the campfire. I am the operator. Our narratives of the odd, the humorous, and the downright horrifying provide a brief respite from the cruel, cold winds of reality, and in turn to bring a measure of warmth to those weary souls that just might need it the most. Our original stories, set in the Roaring Fork Valley and beyond, are written by Patrick Quinn Kitson, whose works include novels Talented and Pyre, and short story compilations Night and Day. Each transmission is performed and engineered by myself, Daniel Kelley. Tonight, we bring you a tale of resourcefulness, that human ability to overcome the suddenly unexpected using ingenuity and occasionally quick thinking. When faced with a seemingly insurmountable challenge, the creativity to transform limitations into opportunities can mean the difference between glory or something far worse. Please, sit back, savor your drink of choice, and enjoy. This is Deep. As the fishing rod rattled about something fierce, and his reel spun out in a frenzy, coughing up yard by yard of clear line into the bluish-green pond's murky depths, Blake momentarily ceased staring up at the wispy clouds and baby blue skies above. He quickly finished, then set down his empty Bud Light bottle and stood. His foldable lawn chair throne stuck, sweat-affixed, to his ass as he walked over to the spot where he'd braced his rod between two large rocks. Falling off about halfway to his destination, the folding chair collapsed into the dirt. Blake neared the rod as the line kept flying from the spool. It was the sort of thing one didn't expect to see when they were minding their sky-gazing business on a perfectly fine Thursday afternoon in August. Fine and dandy, really. His hand deftly flipped around the forest camoed trucker hat on his short brown hair so the bill didn't obscure any of his vision, and took the rod into his grasp. He set the reel, and it immediately bowed the rod in an arc towards the waters of the pond, roughly 50 feet away. Cranking back the spool slowly, he found it was not moving much, and he gave it a good tug to straighten the rod back up. What happened next wasn't what he'd expected either, because he watched as several bubbles, inches in diameter, rose to and popped on the water's surface near where his line entered the murky depths. Before he could blink at the sight, the line in his hands went loose and the rod swept up vertically, forcing him to steady it, barely avoiding a whip crack to the bridge of his nose. Around him, the birds were chirping their final songs of departure as fall was making its colorful, all-too-rapid way towards the first snowfalls. Rustling along the leaf-strewn grasses and rocks nearby was all you usually heard here at the beaver ponds. This trip right here was intended to be some much-deserved R&R. Blake Bunford had needed a break, by golly, and he was determined as can be to have one. See, BB's bait and tackle had seen better times, or mayhaps it hadn't if we're shooting straight. Despite the surrounding area being a mountain-nestled paradise filled to the valley rims with trails, trees, and rich topography, business during the small shop's 2-year run at the Sopris Shopping Center in Carbondale, Colorado, had hardly been booming. A smidge tumultuous might have been a more honest read of the land to the casual observer. Now, this might have been on account of the fact that he was competing with several other well-established shops of the same type within a few miles. Or it could have been because he'd replaced his first manager with himself less than 4 months after opening up his doors, upon discovering that the first glut of the store's profits had been largely dipped into. A man he'd even thought of as a friend had embezzled a stunning amount of money from the company's coffers. Ergo, his grade-A financial investment had rapidly devolved into a laborious, time-consuming grade-A pain in the ass. It certainly wasn't because he had no idea what he was doing. Never that. Advertising hadn't helped much. He didn't have many regulars, and those he did mostly just bought styrofoam cups of worms, spare spools, and hooks. And sure, the business caught a fair flurry of passerby foot traffic from Sounds Easy Video and CD, as well as the walk-in Chinese restaurant situated on either side of it. The latter made the slow-to-grow tackle store, the one Blake had dumped the bulk of his life savings into, smell eternally of egg rolls and wonton soup. But the Chinese food joint and video store were hardly able to help make a dent in the rent. Instead, for the last few months, Blake had been floating on the guilt-drizzled, curmudgeonly generosity of his parents, a gift which was quickly running its own course he knew all too well. Such stark realities left him as the only shop owner in the small mini-mall on Highway 133 to be in financial dire straits, by all accounts. Was it really bad luck? Or was he just kidding himself with this whole cottage industry in which he'd thrust himself? He didn't know, and he had no idea. Either way, he needed a break. Generally several a week, in fact. For a working man needs his peace, by golly. And no place on God's green earth to find your place in peace with the bountiful natural beauty around you than to drop a line into one of the state's hundreds of thousands of fishing holes. Snag a nice spot to kick up your heels. Time aplenty to put back a few brews and keep anything that made noise back in the truck. The world was noisy lately. Too damn noisy. One thing that wasn't so loud was the Colorado wilderness, so long as you knew where to look. And Blake knew where that good shit was. You betcha. For such unwinding, he was partial to one specific hidden gem, a man-made fish catch situated a good ways up Thompson Creek Road, which led up the western hills outlying town. Not that there was much to worry about outside of work these days. Of course, that didn't stop people from trying. Despite it only being August, many folks were already getting up in arms about the fast-approaching dawn of the new millennium. Y2K was what everyone had taken to calling it. To hear the TV chat at you about it, you'd have thunk the world was about to cut the house lights and shut right on off. So some techie knuckleheads forgot to add a digit to a silicone diode or some such buffoonery. And now we were expected to worry about our collective doom? Nope, not in the cards for our man Blake. That was one line he wasn't going to bite down on himself. His gut told him that it was, likely as not, some fat cat ploy. Mayhaps a sly tactic by Duracell and Energizer to prop up global battery sales headed into the uncertain monetary waters of the third millennium. Could be. But, back in the here and now, he had a real odd thing to address, all right. Because after the line dropped down into the water and the surface ripples subsided, Blake wondered if he'd snagged a log that had some air trapped in it, and maybe rolling it over had caused the bubbles. That still left the line suddenly snapping, which he couldn't quite square. It was possible something had taken the bait at the last moment, but... Parked about 20 feet away from where his lawn chair had been set up was his 1995 Ford F-150 truck that his father had given him for his 18th. He'd spent the last year retrofitting it with any and all modifications that had struck his fancy. The thing had a winch, roll bars, diamond plates, and satellite radio. All aftermarket additions, and arguably, all rarely, if ever, utilized. But it was nice to have them just the same. Reaching inside the bed, he yanked out another fishing rod, this one black with a thin red trim highlight, and went to his modest tackle box to reset the line. He tied on a hook, cut said line with his trusty 3-inch pocket knife, baited it, and sauntered back to the double boulder brace he'd fashioned earlier. Shutting his eyes, he allowed for the ear-pleasing whizzing sound of the reel's casting to sing its sweet siren song to him. Hearing the satisfying plunk as it connected with the pond, he wedged the rod's base in the space between the two rocks. Realizing he was now beerless, he walked to the bed again and retrieved a fresh Bud Light. Using his bic to pop the cap, he flicked it into the truck bed and made his way to the lawn chair. Straightening the chair out and setting it back down, he took his cozy place along the shore. There we go. Back in business. Now, where was I? Oh yeah, trees. Watching the branches of the lodgepole pines that surrounded him on all sides lull and sway in the soft breeze, he closed his eyes again and let his mind continue its long journey to nowhere. Chirping birds, clear skies. But then, his reel began to rapidly deploy its line yet again. Opening his eyes and wasting no time, he rushed to the rod. He nearly reached over to grab the pole and give it a finger break to slow the running, but thought better of it. Lucky thing, too, as not another 3 seconds of the reel hissing passed before the rod jerked free of its mooring in the ground, shot like a lawn dart past Blake, and vanished straight into the pond's depths. Standing there, slack-jawed like some damn fool, Blake could not quite reason out what had just happened. There wasn't anything that should have been able to give up that kind of struggle in this little watering hole, not here at the damn beaver ponds. But, actually, now that he thought about it, those same eponymous little critters that you'd usually see or hear at some point during a visit had been wholly absent during his time there. Much like his old high school football locker room, there weren't a single beaver in sight. It had only been about 30 minutes on this particular sojourn, but generally he would have heard the furry buggers working on an upstanding tree or gnawing on a felled bit of log. maybe catch sight of him running along the emerald grasses of the opposing bank's shoreline, on a fishing mission of their own. Not today, though. The place was suddenly even more absent of noise than usual, and he was the sort of fellow who certainly noticed that kind of thing. A surge of bubbling foam surfaced in the middle of the pond, sending ripples toward the pebble-strewn shores. This newly lost rod had been part of his take-home prize for winning the Roaring Fork Anglers Association's Golden Reel Award for the 3rd year in a row. Now vanished in the semi-murky waters of the pond, Blake was confronted with a situation he'd never been confronted with before. Well, now what? He pondered this as he scratched his stubbly chin and turned the hat around on his skull. Something down there thinks it's gonna get the better of me, and it's just not gonna be that way. Not in this life or any other. Crossing the gap between he and his trusty steed of a Ford, he then moved towards the back of the cab and reached into a white cooler that sat just inside the bed. Creaking as its lid flipped open on the white plastic straps, he reached into the meat cooler and, from atop a bed of 2 ice blocks, drew forth a large chunk of bloodless flesh that he'd had in there for a day or so, just waiting for the right fire grill to slap it down on. Ah, deer meat. The good shit. Setting it aside, he reached past the cooler to his truck bed toolbox and opened it up, fumbling for a moment. Then his hand struck gold. Rather, a spool of cable wound up into a handheld feeder. Lastly, he moved further down the truck's length to the back gate and snagged a large painted hook, about as thick as a number 2 pencil and several inches long. Returning to the front of the truck, he began to unspool the cable into a lasso in his other hand. Dropping to his knees, he secured one end to the drawspring on the winch, while the other end of the thick metal wire he attached to the hook. Sinking the orange-colored tip into the slab of deer meat, he loosened his grip on the thick cable and gave some slack up so that he could cast it into the water. Whatever was down there, he would not be taking any more rods from this fisherman. No way. That wasn't about to happen. Near the center of the lake, another massive glug of bubbles belched forth in a frothing semi-spray that reached a height of several feet, like something down there was trying to breach. Oh boy, this is gonna be a whopper, a real wall filler. The catch to end all catches. How a big un like that got in this tiny hole, who knows? But here we go. He stood, and with the slack in his left hand, spun the rope around his head with his right, and squarely flung the hooked chunk of animal meat out into the middle of the big pond. A small, flat splash, and it started to immediately sink. That should do the trick. Ain't nothing down that hole gonna give my rig a run for its gears. No siree. He rushed to the cab and jumped into the driver's seat, closing the door behind him and securing his seatbelt out of habit. Turning the key, he revved the engine for a moment. Then he flicked the switch for the winch to draw up the slack on the line. It went taut a moment later, squealing and freezing in place. The entire truck jostled forward slightly, startling him, as if he was being pulled towards the water's edge. Okay, that's quite a lot of tug it's got there. Probably should just, Blake reached down for the smaller stick shift in the console flooring, then engaged the 4-wheel drive and flung it up. Taking up the taller shifter, he tried to move the stick into reverse and found it wouldn't budge. Not a bit. The truck shuddered and slid another inch towards the green-blue waters of the pond. Blake doubled over as much as his spine would allow so he could throw the full force of his arm into putting it into gear. Yet after another fruitless shove, he knew it wasn't going anywhere, unlike the truck, which was dragged another inch towards the pond. His finger once again flicked the retraction switch of the winch. However, it did not squeal as it had before. Just as with the shifter, it now simply did not move. The truck was slowly dragged another few inches forward and jerked to a rough stop as Blake pressed his foot down hard on the brake. He reached down and, wrapping his hand around the small black lever, engaged the emergency brake as well. His body whipped against the steering wheel, and he felt the breath leave his chest as the truck pitched forward a good foot this time, hopping up and crushing the steering wheel into his sternum. Gasping, his hand fumbled around. Through the windshield, he caught a brief glimpse as another whoosh of water sprayed skyward from the center of the pond. Trying to exit the truck, he was stopped by the hard restraint of the seatbelt holding him steadfast, conveniently engaging at exactly the wrong moment for his needs. Thankfully, though, getting stuck by a seatbelt wasn't something he'd never imagined happening, and his right hand wasted no time in slipping the 3-inch Smith & Wesson knife from his pocket once more, flicking the blade open with his right thumb. Carefully aiming the edge away from his body, he pulled it through the belt fabric with little resistance, and as the vehicle began to stutter shake towards the muddy shore at a steady clip, he pulled open the door and rolled away from the truck. Leaves, debris, and freshly wet mud clung to his clothing as he rose to his feet, brushing it away and watching the truck slowly move away from him. He picked up the small knife from the ground nearby, rubbed the blade against his jeans, clicked it shut, and pocketed it. A half grin of defiance nearly crossed his lips, just as a single thought banished the short-lived self-satisfaction from his face. Oh shit! Remembering that he'd left his shotty on the rack inside the cab, he scrambled to the still-ajar door and, leaning in, snatched the Mossberg pump-action shotgun from the back rack. Thanking the good Lord that he'd known well enough to keep the lock sprung for just such a needed-now occasion, he withdrew the gun and, backing away from the departing vehicle, watched as it was drawn down along the shore and into the rippling waters. Bluish-clear liquid filled the grill, then the cab, and finally the bed, as it did not slow but disappeared just like the two trusty fishing rods had, into the depths with startling speed. Probably not your average fish we got here, he thought wisely. Yet doubt and fear rapidly took hold in his brain. Before any other obvious thoughts could run through his mind, he beheld a sight like no other he'd ever beheld. A single, muscly, iridescent, and largely violet-shaped appendage, what looked to Blake to be a tentacle or some such thing, breached the surface at the pond's center and rose up in the air like a totem. Wriggling to and fro as it ascended skyward and, thick as an oak tree, it shook free the water clinging to it, then straightened out. From slimy paddle tip to where the base hit the pond's surface, it must have been a good 100+ feet in length. Blake, dumbfounded on the shore, aimed his barrel but didn't fire, instead watching in awe as the massive limb crashed down like a chopped tree in the forest, noticeably shaking the ground as it landed on the opposite side of the lake. Water and dust kicked up, and before it moved, Blake knew what was coming next, and crouched instinctively, ready to drop. Dripping, viscous sheets of watery, translucent ooze fell to the leaf-strewn earth from the full length of the purplish tentacle arm. After another moment, and just as Blake had anticipated, it began whipping around the perimeter of the lake, sweeping in wide, searching arcs. Tumbling backward instinctively at the sight, Blake rolled to his left, just as a horizontal swipe cut through the air above his head. The nauseating, wet clicking of suckers, untold numbers of small suction cups lining one side of the massive appendage, whizzed by his ear. Roughly positioned on his butt about 50 feet from the water's edge, he scooted backward and rolled again, this time behind the two rocks he'd been using to brace the rods, and held as still as he could. Hoping that it was using sound or movement to aid its search, he held his breath and listened. Branches cracked, water splashed, and rocks flew through the air all around as the huge, squishy arms smacked and tore through the nearby forest. It paused in midair for a moment, slathering tendrils of slime about, eliciting smaller splashes into the water below, about 50 feet away from him. Then, a slight rustle from a nearby tree caused the appendage to shoot across the water to some distant trunk and rip it, roots and all, from its earthen mooring. Branches cracked like 1,000 whips striking in a choir of crunching wood, as Blake watched it sail overhead and crash into another several large lodgepole pines that bracketed the dirt road winding through the woods, the only exit and likely Blake's eventual destination. As he contemplated how to get there without becoming, well, meat for the beast, as it were, the massive arm made a swift slurp sound, and then Blake could hear little but silence once more, not even the air being disturbed above the pond's surface. 0. Must have gone back down. Cautiously, he turned and placed his palms flat against the rock, peering over the top, as the still rippling and bubbling surface of the water churned less than the length of a football field away. Too close to make a run for it. It could reach out and snatch him in an instant. A rupture at the pond's center momentarily opened a wide chasm, as his F-150 impossibly came flying from the brief liquid hole, careening through the air and spinning like a top along its length. Bent and crumpled, it landed, thumping against the water's edge. The ferocity of said impact carved a huge blast from the sand, like a mortar hit on an enemy shore. It rolled several more times, striking a grove of trees not far from where the other tree had struck before, and stopped. Quiet descended upon the area. Without a moment's hesitation, Blake stood and started to walk quietly yet steadily in the direction of the break in trees that the road intersected through. Careful not to step on any sticks and make too much noise, he hurried along for all of 15 seconds, just long enough to think he might be able to pull off his little exit via stage left, before the respite was quickly dashed by the tentacle breaching the waters again. With shocking agility, it sought and found him in an instant, picking him up and lifting him several feet into the air, while slowly drawing him nearer the pond edge. The shotgun remained snugly pressed against his side in a way that rendered it wholly ineffective for the time being. The compressive force of the slimy arm was enough to cut off the air completely from Blake's chest, He wriggled in its hard grasp just enough to force his chest above the fold of its grip, allowing airflow to continue unabated. He tried to pull his arm free, finding it impossible with the shotgun still tightly clung in his grasp. Making a faster decision than he would have suspected himself able, he dropped the gun, and after a 15-foot drop, it fell onto its side, on the embankment below Blake's now dangling Doc Martens. Carefully slipping the knife from his pocket as he drew it up, he managed to slide his right arm above the fleshy vice grip of the suckered tentacle. To that point, the sensation of all these little cups clung against his damn flesh was making his spine crawl with the sensation of a million tiny nerve bugs marching along his vertebrae.
Never again will be too soon for this feeling,
he mused, as his right thumb flicked open the serrated 3-inch blade, spun it into a stabbing position in his palm, then dropped it down and pulled toward himself. The flesh gave way easily under the sharp edge and oozed with fresh violet blood from the foot-long gash. Immediately, the suckers clasping onto his arms, stomach, and thighs withdrew as he felt himself falling down. He came down hard on his right leg and his knee nearly buckled, just barely taking the impact without crashing him down. The left absorbed the remaining shock of landing, and he stood up for a moment, waving his arms to regain his balance. The tentacle shook, 20 or more feet above him, twisting and untwisting, covering him with tiny droplets of purple rain. He knelt down and grabbed the shotgun. Not hesitating, he fired a round into the middle of the writhing mass. This blast opened a much larger hole along the spiny ridge that ran the length of the serpentine appendage, gushing forth purple blood in thick spurts. Blake had only enough time to pump the barrel, then nearly take aim before the paddle end of the thing's arm hit him in his ribcage, sending him backward into the dirt. His head tucked into his chest so that he avoided a cranial impact with a nearby rock as he hit the ground, tumbling several times. Conscious but dazed, he slowly pulled himself around onto his elbows and butt. The shotgun lay a few feet to his right. Struggling for equilibrium and unaware of where the thing was, he was disturbed and surprised to feel it ensnare his right ankle and wrap as a snake might around his leg and towards his groin. Jerking hard at his lower half, his body began to inch towards the water's edge, just as his now dilapidated truck had. Feeling something in or around his knee finally sound off a disconcerting pop, then give way to an exasperating wash of fiery hot pain shooting along his thigh, he knew that his right leg was now basically useless for all intents and purposes.
Fuck!
He hollered in agony, the likes of which he'd never personally experienced.
Oh, god damn it. That's some real shit. God damn it.
Pulling him along the grassy, muddy ground with less than half of its original strength, if that, the arm spurted a wide gush of thick, black-violet blood from the wound along the ridging. Hitting the ground, a splash of it spattered onto Blake's blue jeans. His eyes, frantically casting about, caught sight of the Mossberg in his periphery. Scratched fingers reached out to grab the shotgun, but it was about a foot wide of the digits on his right hand. He continued sliding along the mud and jerked his body to the right. Snatching at the barrel, he missed it again, stopped by the red-hot alarm bell of his right knee, keeping him from another inch of pursuit. He cried out in pain, dropped hard onto his back, and, still inching along, noticed he was now but a few feet from the pond's embankments. Blake figured that he had about 5 seconds before he was at the pearly gates, staunchly arguing with his creator about the utterly ridiculous circumstances regarding his premature demise, so it was time to giddy up. Now or never, little doggy. He threw all of his weight to his right side, taking his kneecap to another threshold of suffering that he'd only heard about in war stories, and willed his hand to draw the gun to himself. Reaching the rubber grip, he clamped on with 2 fingertips and yanked it to him. It came another few inches his way, which was all he needed. Grabbing the barrel, he took the gun into both hands and aimed at the biggest, nearest chunk of it that he could.
Let go, you slimy mother trucker!
He racked the shell, then squeezed the trigger. Despite being a licensed hunter, and a seasoned hand with most firearms, even he was surprised at the deafening crack the blast let out with his target poised at such close range. Echoing electric hums permeated his brain as his eardrums fell mostly into temporary deafness. Only the faintest of muffled sound was now penetrating the auditory miasma in blurbs and babs. Erupting more blood and bits of shredded purple flesh, the grasp of the tentacle-tipped arm gave up. Receding away from Blake's lower half, it shot out in one last spasm, cracking like a whip and splitting from the spot where it had been blasted at close range. While most of the arm fell to the shore with another hard thump, the thick, gushing stump withdrew back to the center of the lake, quickly vanishing below the rippling surface. Shimmering purple plumes of blood blotted out the clarity of the pond waters, rising up and leaving floating, viscous slime patches. Blake exhaled loudly and dropped his head and arms outstretched back to the wet earth. His eyes watched leaves from the highest canopy above fall all around him. He noticed how silent it was again, just the way he liked it, nice and quiet. Whatever was down there, it seemed that it had finally figured that the juice wasn't worth the squeeze on this one, and had presumably beat a hasty retreat back to the dark place from whence it had come. Blake imagined it now swiftly retreating through the same network of underwater tunnels and grottos it had utilized to arrive at the beaver ponds with him that fateful day. He couldn't be sure of anything, but for all he knew, he'd delivered it a mortal blow. For all he knew, he'd just slayed a damn kraken. Though that last one seemed a bit fanciful. Fanciful. Shit. Fanciful? What the hell's fanciful now, after all this shit? Another 5 minutes of letting his knees numb up, and with no more bubbles breaching the pond waters, he unloaded the remaining rounds from the gun. Then, as one might utilize a crutch, he used it to prop himself to his feet once more. Looking back up the shore in the vague direction of his crushed and mangled mess of vehicular metal, now certainly found en route dead, his weary eyes locked onto the still twitching purple appendage, lying severed and caked with muddy dirt and grass. Wiggling and jerking at several spots along its length, the motions were slowing and diminishing in strength. Pinkish, black-ringed cups zigzagging its inner arms still reflexively sucked at the air like 1,000 gasping mouths. The muscles gave the occasional twitch, the odd spasm, but he was satisfied, having watching more than a couple things die in his day, that the bastard was done for, and this fight, such as it had been, was through. Only God Almighty knew for sure what had happened to the rest of it. But Blake didn't know, and he had no idea, which was just fine and dandy with him. He was still in one piece, and that'd have to do. Squinting at the rays of light shooting bolts between the thicket of the surrounding forest, he rubbed a small nick on his cheek and licked the blood from his fingertip. And then, at last, with his mental clouds parting, the silver lining fluttered to the front of Blake Bunford's mind. One thing's for sure, though, he thought with a wry smile passing over his cut and bloodied lips. That puppy right there is damn sure to attract a whole lot of foot traffic once it's up on the wall in the shop. Shoot, might be high time to ring up the old boys over at Field & Stream and tell them we got us a cover story in the making. Woo, Nelly! A quiet, pleasant afternoon outdoors is a luxury sought after by many. But few things are more frustrating than when that peace is shattered by unexpected intrusions, whether it be a group of kids playing too close to your park bench, or a 10-story tall purple tentacle looking for a lightly pickled afternoon snack. However, the occasional silver lining reminds us that these impositions just might bring accidental gifts that shape our very fates. Transmissions from the Campfire is produced by myself, Daniel Kelley, and by Patrick Kitson. Tonight's episode was engineered and performed by me. Deep is an original work of fiction written by Patrick Quinn Kitson, creator of the emergent valley horror genre. More of Patrick's work is available in the short story collections Night and Day, and the forthcoming novels Talented and Pyre. Transmissions from the Campfire and Deep are both copyrighted works that may not be reproduced or re-uploaded in part or in full, without express written permission from their respective creators. If you enjoyed our time together, you can find more episodes of Transmissions from the Campfire on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or your favorite podcast directory. Please subscribe to be notified when each new transmission commences. Now, zip your jacket and cinch your collar tight, as the light of the fire dies down and our power cells are once again depleted. Temporary warmth gives way to the icy bitterness of existence with the return of dawn. Stay safe, traveler, until we meet again around the campfire.